Yeah, exactly. Or to the local function namespace. Yeah, exactly. Extract takes an associative array that's got a whole bunch of key values. X equals Y, Z equals W. And what it does is it extracts into the stack frame in question variables X and Z and assigns them values Y and W so that now you can just say $X, $Z as usual. So why do I care about that? Well, the next line of code here is to require header.php, which is almost identical to before, but notice what I've done up top. I've generalized the title as coming from a variable called title. Now, I'll pick on my own code. I don't really have any error checking just yet, right? If you don't pass me a title, this is going to give me an undefined reference to it's going to trigger a notice because that variable might not exist. So we can do better. But at least I had the foresight to remember this oddly named function to escape my inputs just so that a user doesn't intentionally or accidentally inject some JavaScript code or the like, which can typically violate someone's privacy. All right, so that's a little better. Let's see if we can't do even better than that. So in version 3, that was kind of a waste of code that I just wrote. Render header, render footer. Why don't we generalize the idea of templates themselves? Let me define a function called render that takes two arguments, potentially. The first of which is the name of the template that I want to render. The second of which is an array of key value pairs that I want to insert into that template. So now I can use the same function at top and bottom. And if I look now in helpers.php, I have just one function here. I also have this. So anyone recognize this kind of syntax up top? It's obviously a comment, but I seem to be using the same style. Yeah, so this is something we'll preach and ultimately require for your own code. So there's different tools that do this. And if you wrote Java code in high school or even here, you might be familiar with JavaDoc, which is pretty much identical to this. That kind of became the de facto standard. And JavaDoc, or in this case PHPDoc, is a set of conventions that you adhere to in such a way that when you run a command, PHPDoc, on your code, or in the world of Java, JavaDoc on your code, it will read through all of your .php files, look for all of the comments that are structured exactly like that, and then generate for you a special web page or suite of web pages that document all of your functions' names and return values and arguments and comments and all of that so that you yourself don't have to. You just comment your code along the way. You use these little tags like @param to say this function takes a parameter, its type is array, it's called data, and then I can even put some words there if it's not wholly obvious, key value pairs, and that will automatically get inserted into my documentation. And certainly working with other people or producing code that you want to allow the rest of the world to use, a la open source, my God, this is what you can provide your partner with. You can start, and I do this myself when starting projects, you start by writing your PHP files and just writing the functions' names and signatures, so what arguments they take, and then you just do open curly brace, close curly brace, and inside you write / to do. Right? And you come back to this later. But you document it above. Then you run a command like phpdoc, and voila, you show your partner, here's what I'll implement for you. It might take you 2 weeks, but at least you've agreed on these conventions early on. So getting into this habit is now useful not just for you, but also potentially for others. All right, so that's a little cleaner now. And I'm doing a little error checking. If the file exists, go ahead and require it. Otherwise, don't do anything. But let's take things up a notch further. Let me go into index.php in version 4. And what have I done here? So there's only one material difference in this file. It might be hard to spot, but does anyone notice what I did differently? Yeah, includes. So we kind of used this convention in CS50's pset 7 if you took that, if you did that pset. But we didn't really preach this philosophy. But it's definitely important when it comes time to actually writing software that real users are going to use. And by that I mean this. Let me go ahead and do ls in this directory. And notice that I've cleaned things up a little bit, just like pset 7. Rather than put all of my PHP files in the same folder, I kind of want to isolate them so that the related files are all clustered together in a folder. And by related, I mean things like the templates. Like header.php, footer.php is never supposed to be visited directly by a user. So why is it in the equivalent of my public HTML directory? Right? The user shouldn't even need to know that exists. And frankly, I don't even want him or her to just guess by typing in random URLs that there might be be other files there. So I might want to put it in a directory and then somehow set permissions on that directory so that the rest of the world can't even access it. So this example here, 4, is a step toward that, where in templates, I've put precisely those files, header and footer.php, and includes, even though there's not much there, I've put helpers.php. So it's a step toward better organization. But find fault still. What's still problematic about this directory structure? Yeah?
Every time you want to make a new lecture or add one, you have to copy lecture 1 still or lecture 0.
All right, good. So we still haven't solved that original problem, which is there's going to be some copy and paste next week when I make lecture 2.php and lecture 3. So we can fix that. And then 2, just this idea of security, right, really includes and templates. They don't need to be web accessible. The contents of those files do need to be, but their file names don't need to ever appear in URLs. So ideally, where would I want to put includes and templates in terms of my folder structure? Above, right? MV something ... Get it out of there, right? And this is a principle that's all too commonly ignored, especially with various open source projects, and even CodeIgniter, which we'll introduce in just a bit. These open source tools, MediaWiki and the like, which are meant to be easy for users to use, and they typically say, OK, download this zip file, unzip it, put it in your public HTML directory, and you're on your way. The problem then is that all of the logic of the program is publicly accessible, and things like config.php, which we had in 50 for pset 7, I mean, God forbid you screw up the web server's web configuration, even for just a few minutes. Maybe your PHP files will just be completely publicly accessible. In fact, we can simulate this. So I have a web server here on the computer. Normally, this is example 4. If I go into example 4 and click on index.php, which is what I'm seeing now, suppose I'm bad at system administration and I screw up, or I'm on a shared web host and someone else screws up. Let me become root for a moment. So for those unfamiliar, sudo su makes me become root. I don't need a password in this version of the appliance. If I go into etc httpd conf.d, and we'll talk about these things in passing over time. These are conventions in Linux systems as to where things are stored. Notice that there's some PHP stuff in here. Let me accidentally open up mod suphp, and let me do this. Let me turn off PHP, which effectively is what that thing does. And now if I type service httpd restart, this means restart the web server software. And now I go back to my browser and reload. I didn't disable it enough. One sec. php.conf. Oh, it's in there too. That's why. OK. Let's restart the server once more. All right. This happens. Now, granted, you have to be a real idiot to jump through that many hoops to actually expose your code in this way. But most of the time, you're using shared web hosting sites if you're not owning or leasing your own servers. So all it takes is for one simple misconfiguration, or someone makes a typo in the web server or PHP's configuration, the result of which is it just doesn't load properly. And voila, you try visiting a page on the internet, and people see what's inside of your files. Now imagine this file is not something boring like lectures.php, but instead config.php, inside of which is your database usernames and passwords, your Amazon referral passwords, or anything that you're using inside of your website that's private is now public. So in short, we got to get that stuff outside of those directories. So let's see how we can do this. First, let me roll back these changes. Mod suphp. And over time, you'll likely get all the better at administering your own server by playing around with these things. So let's go now into version 5 of this. Now notice the difference. So in version 5, nothing is inside of this root directory. I have a README, which is meant to be documentation after today, if you want to play around with these. I have includes and templates still. But now, by convention, I created an HTML directory. I could have called it anything I want. Public HTML is often used when it's your private personal folders. When it's an actual full website, people usually say HTML or docs or htdocs. Doesn't matter. But the appliance assumes HTML. And inside of the HTML directory are only those files that are meant to be web accessible. So what's the implication here? Well, if I look at index.php, notice that the only thing I really have to change is this. I have to require a file that's in // includes /helpers.php. But this is OK, because the web server is configured to only allow access now to everything below the HTML directory. And even though includes and templates live alongside of it, because they are no longer in the same directory, but alongside of it, you can now enforce at the web server level that nothing outside of HTML will be accessible. And now, in the worst case, if you screw up, you might expose what's in your HTML directory, but you're not going to accidentally expose the templates or the includes directory, and yet your own PHP code can still access it via .. / or the like. So admittedly, you do have to tweak your web server configuration, and you, as an end user, cannot do this trick in your public HTML directory as easily if you want to isolate everything to the same folder. Just as an aside, the reason we didn't preach this in something like 50 is because if we want your accounts to be web accessible, you would have to put some files in public HTML, some files in your home directory. Then when you submit things, you get everything else that's in your home directory. So it's just messy, but we'll do it better in this class. So that's an improvement. But let's do one other thing here. So let's now actually start to implement this idea of MVC, the model view controller. We're going to do away with the model today. I'm not going to bother with a database because we have very small data sets here in terms of lectures. But let's see if I can implement the idea of a controller. So now notice, just as I described in the story earlier, now I only have index.php. So this is the first attempt of mine at implementing the the V and the C in MVC. So I'm implementing my own sort of web architecture. Now this gets a little tedious over time, and so in the end, a lot of people do end up using frameworks, as we will for the first project. But let's see what's going on here. So first, I require some helpers. So there's some functions in there, not interesting just yet. But now notice this. Determine which page to render. So I have a little bit of logic at the top of index.php that's asking if a page HTTP parameter is set, go ahead and assign it to the page variable. Otherwise, just assume some hard-coded value, index by default. So in other words, if the user visits a URL of the form, let's say http example.com / page equals foo, I want to either remember foo in that variable or the default of index. Now, these are ugly URLs, but we can fix that later. So what do I do now? I have a switch that says, well, if the page in question is index, what do I want to render for the user? Well, let me first render the header, which is in the templates directory, and here's a dynamic title like we talked about before. Then render the index. And index, we'll see, is just a template really, but it just has the HTML tags for the home page. No header or footer, just that raw content. And then I'm going to go ahead and render the footer, and that's it. But oh, wait a minute, if the page is instead lecture, let me first check this. Did the user pass in a variable called n also? Because if so, I want to show the lecture template and pass in the variable n. In other words, if the user visited a URL that instead looked like this, lecture and n equals 1, ideally I want that to show me lecture 1's page or lecture 0's page or the lectures page. So we're parameterizing the URLs now. So if I want to do lectures down here, same idea, but I render the lectures template, all the while using that same render function that we wrote a little bit ago. So there's nothing else in HTML. It is perfectly isolated to just the controller. But if I go into includes, I still see helpers.php. And if I go into views, which you can think of for now as synonymous with what we called templates before, now I have index, lecture, and lectures. And just because header and footer are a little special, I put them in a subdirectory. Frankly, I don't really like this approach, but it's what CodeIgniter, a framework we'll use, does. So I borrowed their same approach. So notice the structure again is controller is in HTML, views are in views, and includes is just everything else that we might want to embody. So let's see the result. Let me go back to my appliance in Chrome. Let me go ahead and choose version. Let's see, this is version, where was I just now? 6. And by 8, you'll be amazed. Go into HTML, lectures, and it seems to be working. But notice the new URLs. You know, it's not the prettiest of things, but at least we've kind of started separating out our code functionality. As an aside, this is not normal. The fact that you can see HTML and includes and views and click on any one of these directories is a result of our being in a lecture environment and not in a production environment. If this were a production web server, we would cut off access to everything except HTML. All right, so this doesn't feel perfectly clean just yet. You know what's really bothering me? If only because I'm A little anal? Those URLs are horrific, right? That's sort of like 2001 style URLs. We can do better than this. So what do URLs usually look like these days? For something like this, I feel like I'd like to see /lectures or /lecture/0 or the like. Now, there's actually some motivation for these, right? So search engines, for instance, typically will index URLs that look like actual file names much